Spontaneous weeknight entertaining is really fun, but it takes a little bit of planning ahead. Today I'm going to show you 3 terrific recipes, some of which you can make ahead of time, to make your weekday entertaining a lot more fun and flavorful. On today's show, we're going to start with dessert because really, it is the best part of the meal. I love having pie on hand all the time, but sometimes I just don't feel like making pie. So I've come up with a recipe that is a super speedy way to assemble a delicious dessert you can keep in the freezer anytime. We're going to start by making a crumble topping, and we've got soft butter for that. We've got some rolled oats. If you like, you could add in chopped nuts, but we're going to keep this nut-free because if it's for spontaneous entertaining, you never know what the requirements of your guests are going to be. A little bit of cinnamon and some brown sugar. And we're just going to crumble that together. It's going to end up looking a lot like cookie dough, which is exactly what you want. And that step is out of the way. If you wanted to spread the work over 2 days, for example, you can always make the crumble topping and just put it in the fridge. I actually like to keep a bag of crumble topping in the freezer at all times, so if I ever feel like making a fruit crisp, that part of the process is already out of the way. There, so that's nicely mixed together now, and we're just going to set it aside because it'll go on the pie right before it does its final baking. So the next step is to make the crust, but we're not rolling pastry here either. We're going to put a nice shortbread crust into our springform pan. So to do that, we've got some flour, a little bit of sugar. This tart is not too sweet, which I also really like, and then some very cold butter. And the reason you want the butter cold is that way it blends in little granules instead of kind of forming a smooth paste. So we've cut 3/4 of a cup of butter into nice chunks, and it's just fresh out of the fridge, so it's really cold. And you're going to pulse it until it turns into kind of the consistency of coarse sand. So we'll just pulse it for a few moments here. If you don't have a food processor, you can do this step by hand with a pastry blender, and the results will be just as good. You want to just keep checking it to make sure that there's no big chunks of butter left behind. And I'm going to give it one more shot, and I think we're ready to go. So isn't that a lot faster than mixing up pastry and then having to chill it and roll it out? So now we're just going to dump it into the pan. Just watch out for your blade, nice and sharp there. And it may look like a crumbly mess, but don't worry, it's going to turn out just great. Shortbread is actually pretty forgiving, especially in pie form. Use a rubber scraper or your fingertips to pat it down. Try and get it fairly even so that it ends up being a consistent layer on the bottom. And then as soon as we've got it nice and flat, we're going to pop it in the oven for about 12 to 15 minutes so that it's a nice solid base to put our fruit filling on. Now that we've got our crust prepared, we're going to make the beautiful fruit filling. Today I've got some nice sweet cherries that I've thawed. You could easily use strawberries, peaches, plums, anything you like. And we're going to chop these. You can do it by hand, but I really like doing it in the food processor. And I'm just taking them out carefully so that I don't get all the juice in there. Kind of looks like a crime scene, but it'll be a delicious crime scene. With the fruit being that juicy, you know it's also going to get a little bit soft. So we're going to add in a little sugar and a little cornstarch. But we'll put the rest of that in after we chop the cherries. So again, just a couple of quick pulses. And the reason for doing that is a whole cherry can be kind of a mouthful. I think it needs one more pulse. So you'll get a much smoother fruit layer this way. Now we're just going to put the cherries in a bowl and add a little bit more sugar as mentioned and some seasonings. There we go. So they're nice and perfectly pureed. So we're going to mix up the sugar and cornstarch, and the reason for doing that is it distributes the cornstarch and keeps it from getting lumpy. So we'll just put the rest of that in. We're going to add a little bit of cinnamon because there's cinnamon in our crumble topping, so then you get the flavors kind of matching. And we're also going to add a tiny bit of almond extract. Cherries and almond happen to be a really great flavor combination. I have a book called The Flavor Bible, and I use that when I'm creating recipes to help me unlock some of the secrets of those really great flavor matches. It saves a lot of time and trial and error. And the last thing we're going to do is add a little bit of fresh lemon juice. That's a pretty common ingredient in a lot of pies, and it's because it helps the fruit flavor really shine through. Too much and it'll overpower it, but just a little bit of lemon is great. So here we've got about 2 tablespoons. Perfect. So we give that a stir, and then we're going to put it on top of our shortbread base and try and spoon it on fairly evenly. Doesn't have to be perfect. It will spread out a little bit. It smells so good. I'm smelling the cherry and the almond, and it just smells great. You could even prepare fruit this way to just serve on top of ice cream or on yogurt, and it would be a really delicious dessert. There we go. We'll just dump the rest of that on, spread it around, and there's our fruit layer all ready to go. And last up, we've got our crumble topping that we had prepared. And this time I'm going to put it on with my fingertips just because it's a little bit easier to be more precise. You want to try and get it really evenly spread all over the tart. Because this is like a cookie dough, as I mentioned before, it's going to bake up pretty much looking like a cookie. It's kind of a nice solid crumbly layer, so it's a bit more cohesive than you would find on a fruit crumble. And just a little more on this side, and it's just the right amount of topping to cover it. There we go. So now we have to put our tart back in the oven for about 12 to 15 minutes to bake that cookie layer. And here we have one that's just come out of the oven, and it's all ready to go. We're going to take the springform ring off. First we'll just run a knife around the edge to make sure it's nice and loose. And it is. And we'll unbuckle it and lift the lid off, and there we have it. And when you cut into the tart, you'll see all the layers in there. It comes out just beautifully. You can see the shortbread, you can see the cherry filling, and you can see the crumble topping. And you also notice how easy that is to slice up. Usually it's a good idea to wait for it to cool before you do slice it. Finish cutting it all the way around, let it cool thoroughly, put it in a container and pop it in the freezer, and it'll be ready for your next spontaneous dinner party. Coming up, I'm going to share with you a family favorite which we call Winner Winner Chicken Dinner. You can assemble it the night before and tuck it in the fridge, then cook it up hot and fresh for when your guests arrive. It's got herbs, garlic, tomatoes, and it's absolutely wonderful. I don't know about you, but I found brown rice used to be a really hard sell in my household. My family loves all kinds of white rice, from jasmine to basmati, sushi rice, but I had a difficult time getting them to accept brown rice until I found the secret trick. You toast the brown rice in a skillet before you cook it with water. What that does is it causes the grains to start to crack open, so they will absorb more moisture and be much softer and more tender. They also develop a really nice nutty flavor. So next time you want to try brown rice for your family, consider toasting it first. This Mega Head Chicken Dinner has a lot of family favorite flavors: tomatoes, garlic, olive oil, balsamic, and thyme. It's pretty easy to throw together, and what I love about it is that you can make it one day and cook it the next if that suits your schedule. So I'm working today with some chicken thighs. I really love them because they are dark meat. They've got a lot more flavor. They tend to cook up moister and more juicy. And you take a look at your thighs, see if they need any trimming. These ones don't have a lot of excess fat, it appears, so I can just put them right in the pan. If I see there's a little bit more skin than I like, I could trim that off. For this dish, I really like to use skin on thighs because it helps add to the pan juices. But if you're concerned about fat contents for your family, you could use skinless thighs. It's really nice if you can find boneless, skinless, but they are hard to find. And if you've got extra time on your hands, you could debone these ones. Depending on the size of your pan, you should be able to fit in anywhere from 4 to 6 or 8 pieces of chicken. You want to make sure they're not too crowded. As you can see here in this pan, we've got lots of room between them. And the reason for that is we want to tuck our tomatoes and garlic in around the chicken. So I'm just going to have these cherry tomatoes and start to scatter them in. And I'm using them to kind of insulate the chicken from the sides of the pan. You could make this dish with chicken breasts, but you would definitely want to have them with the skin on to get a lot more flavor. If you wanted to take a whole chicken apart, if you have that talent, then that would be another great way to prepare this. So just as many tomatoes as you can kind of fit comfortably in the pan. As I mentioned, just kind of tucking them in around the chicken. I think I can get a couple more in here. The more the merrier, because when you serve them up, you want to make sure everyone gets a few tomatoes on their plate. There we go. Oh, I see room to tuck in even one more. I really like tomatoes. Okay, so then we are going to take some cloves of garlic and tuck those in around. Again, really like the garlic, so I have about 6 cloves here. Some of them are big, so I cut them in half, just because I want to make sure they cook through and the great flavor gets released. So just snuggle those in there, distributing them fairly evenly around the pan. And last up, you want to add fresh herbs. That's for this component, and then we'll decorate them all. Rosemary is really great with this dish, but I have a real thing about thyme right now. I have a lot of time for thyme. So I'm just going to put some sprigs on top and then also tuck a few down in with the tomatoes and garlic. The ones on top will infuse the chicken, and then the ones on the sides will infuse the vegetables. That looks pretty good. One more there. And now the seasoning. So we're going to use some olive oil, and you don't have to measure this. That's one of the beauties of this recipe. There's no measuring needed. Just a good drizzle over top of the chicken. Try and make sure you coat the tops fairly well, because that will help the skin get nice and crispy. And then about half as much of the balsamic. I've tried making this dish shaking the oil and balsamic together, and it doesn't seem to make any difference, so why worry about that step? And then last up, some generous grinds of salt and pepper. And it really doesn't need any more seasoning than that. So at this point, if I was making this dish for tomorrow, I would simply cover it with saran or plastic wrap. And if you need to, because of the foil here, put an elastic band around to secure it on. The reason I've lined the pan with foil is it makes for a super speedy cleanup, which is what you want on a weeknight dinner. So this takes about a half an hour, depending on the size of the chicken pieces, to bake at 400 degrees. And when it comes out, you're going to have these beautiful golden brown chicken breasts. The tomatoes and garlic are nicely softened, and there's a lovely sauce in the bottom of the pan. So we're just going to plate this up. You could put it individually on people's plates, but it also is really nice to put it on a serving platter. I find it's a step we don't always do, but it makes it just look a little bit more special, especially if you are having guests. So just take out all the chicken. And then using a spoon, scatter the garlic and the tomatoes over top and pick up quite a bit of the pan juice at the same time. If I were serving this, I would consider buttered noodles as a great base, or some brown rice, which you've toasted before you've cooked. And that just makes a really, really nutritious main dish. You can see how great it looks, and if you could have a chance to smell these aromas, you'd know how wonderful it's going to taste. One last tomato over here. Oh, and we'll tuck one over here. And there you go. There's your winner chicken dinner.
Up next, I'm going to show you a kale salad recipe that just might surprise you. In fact, when I've made this, I've never seen my family dive into a bowl full of greens with such gusto. The secret trick? Well, you're about to find out.
I'm ashamed to admit that growing up, my family salads mostly consisted of iceberg lettuce. It was a bit of a revolution when we discovered romaine, but it was years before we moved on from the basic lettuce, carrot, cucumber, tomato combo. Times have changed, certainly in my household, and now one of our favorite kinds of salad is kale salad. A lot of people tell me they want to like kale, but they find it too chewy, they don't know how to work with it. And here I'd like to show you a couple of tips and a great recipe that should get you enjoying kale a lot more often. First up is how to work with the kale. You do have to wash it, obviously, as with all greens, but it doesn't tend to go limp nearly as quickly, so you don't have to worry as much about giving it time to crisp up in the fridge. Now how to get the kale off its stems. You generally don't want to eat these stems, they're pretty tough and woody. All you have to do is turn it upside down, run your fingers along the stem like a zipper, and the kale comes off and you're left with the stem to cast aside. That was a really big epiphany for me as well when I learned that trick. So we're just going to unzip a few more here. Last one, there. Now we've just got this big mountain of kale. Another trick with kale is it's really a good idea to chop it up pretty small. So I'm just going to gather it into a big ball here, hold it with my left hand, and I'm going to start chopping with my right. Because when you've taken the pieces off the stem, they're fairly small, you usually don't have to do too many crosswise cuts once you've done these cuts. Just about done here. And a couple of crosswise. Just give it a visual check over. I can see a couple of big pieces that I missed, and that's all you need to do. So we're going to transfer this to our bowl, and don't be alarmed, it looks like it's going to explode out of the bowl, but you'll find out when you dress it that it actually compacts quite a bit. There we go. So I'm just going to put the board aside because we don't need that anymore, and the stems as well. All right, so the dressing is a big deal with kale because it doesn't have a really strong flavor like arugula or something. So you want to make sure it's a pretty zippy dressing. So I'm going to make one of my favorite simple ones, which is just 3 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of balsamic, a couple of grinds of salt and pepper. You always want some salt when there's acid because it helps to keep it from being too sour. And in fact, that's the way to rescue a dressing. If you're making a vinaigrette with cider vinegar or lemon and you taste it and it's too sour, the temptation is to add sugar, but in fact, you can correct that dressing just by adding a little bit of salt and tasting it again. And you can see I'm a big fan of fresh lemons. Good for vitamins, good for flavor. We're just going to add probably about a tablespoon. There we go. And once again, we shake our dressings in a shaker jar because it's just the easiest way to go. Now this may be more dressing than we need for this quantity of kale, so I'm going to drizzle it on carefully and just see how we're doing. I think probably about half will do it for now, and then we'll see what happens. And here comes the magic part. 2 hands, jump into the kale. This massaging is what really makes the difference, and you really have to work at it hard. Almost imagine that you're tearing it apart with your hands. And you probably need to do it for a good 30-40 seconds. You'll feel the kale literally start to wilt under your fingertips. It's quite amazing. And it'll get really glossy and shiny as the fibers start to break down and the kale absorbs the dressing. So don't be shy. I know it's messy, but it just makes a big, big, big difference. The nice thing is the kale won't go soggy in a big hurry, so you can actually do this step ahead of time and then have time to wash your hands before you're receiving guests at the door. Just give my hands a little clean up here. Get most of the bits off. There we go. Now that would be a delicious salad on its own, but toppings to me can take a salad to the next level. So for this particular salad, I've got some chopped dried cranberries we're going to sprinkle on. And you don't want to overdo it. You can always put more on the table for people to add their own. I've got some chopped toasted walnuts. That adds some protein to what is otherwise a vegetarian or vegan dish. And then cheese for even more protein. So it's definitely not a vegan dish anymore. And we're just going to give it a little bit of a toss to distribute those toppings. And now you have a tender and delicious kale salad ready to go for your spontaneous weeknight dinner party. With these 3 delicious recipes, you never need to fear spontaneous entertaining again. Winner, winner chicken dinner comes together in a hurry. Kale salad is tender and delicious thanks to my special tips. And you can enjoy this cherry pie with very little work. I hope you host a dinner party on a weeknight soon.